Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to say a few words at the Europa Forum, and it's particularly generous of you, given that I'm a British Prime Minister and in the light of Brexit, which is where I'll start. So we're right in the middle of a general election campaign at the moment, so I'm going to choose my words with care. Obviously, you will know that I was strongly opposed to Brexit, but we've had a referendum, the decision has been taken. I would just offer these two comments on it. The first is that we haven't really begun the negotiation yet. We're going to begin now. I think there will be a lot of debate around the implications of this once we see what it actually means. In particular, what the decision to withdraw from the single market and customs union really means for the British economy. So I think there's a big process of debate and education that will go on following the general election in the UK. And I think the second thing I would therefore say is that it's important these negotiations are transparent, with maximum flexibility on all sides, with goodwill on all sides, and that we keep the lines of communication open. There's going to be a lot more information that we have about what Brexit really means over the next few months as the contours of the negotiation, as the types of alternative deals become clear. And that's why I think it's important, given that this is going to be happening at a time of immense challenge, both for Britain and for Europe, that we keep our minds as open and as flexible as possible on all sides. Europe, more or less, I think Europe more and less. In other words, I think there's certain things that Europe should concentrate upon and where it needs to integrate and cooperate more closely. And then there are certain areas in which Europe should try as far as possible to keep out of doing things it doesn't really need to do. The case for Europe remains as strong today as it's ever been, in many ways stronger. And the rationale for Europe today is less to do with what it was from my father's generation, which was peace, and more to do today with power as the geopolitics of the world changes around us. To have the biggest political union, the largest commercial market in the world, is of immense importance to the individual interests of the countries that make up the European Union. Why? Because we live in a world in the 21st century in which there will not simply be the power of America, but also the now emerged power of China, of India, of other very large population countries, who as time goes on and as GDP becomes more and more linked to population, then the necessity of having a strong Europe becomes all the more important to what are, frankly, medium-sized countries or small countries. So the European Union's collective self-interest is clear, and the case for Europe is clear. But we've got to accept that over these past years, particularly following the financial crisis, we've seen the stresses and strains of globalization. And the European Union is in one sense a great coming together of nations. So in one sense, it represents many of those forces of globalization. But there are stresses both cultural and economic. Culturally, people see their societies changing around them as a result of migration, and it causes anxiety, particularly when linked to security concerns. And economic, because having gone through the financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis, obviously people have suffered enormous economic hardship and pain as we've come through that very difficult period. So my view is that the challenge for Europe is it has to show how it's capable of meeting these cultural and economic stresses of globalization and recapturing and rekindling the spirit of optimism, which is what gave rise to the European Union and has made so many of us such strong supporters of it over the years. What does that mean in practical terms? Very briefly, obviously I think for the Eurozone it's going to require a deeper integration, a combination of being able to come to the point where the single currency performs, looks like, is constituted as a genuine single currency zone, alongside strong set of structural reforms in those economies that need those structural reforms in order that the single currency zone can have countries that are coming together economically as well as politically. Secondly, I think it means driving through increasing change in the single market, again, to make sure that it is a true single market. Third, I think Europe's got to look very carefully at its policies for innovation. It's the fact that the largest tech companies in the world are outside of Europe, not inside of Europe. We've got to ask ourselves the question, why is that? What policy changes do we need? Then I think we are missing the opportunity to get far greater cooperation in several different areas. So another area I would say is education, where, again, Europe should be thinking how it uses the fact that we have these different countries and cultures coming together. We have some great European universities, but do we have the right set of cooperations between them that are good not just for the education of our young people, but also for the improvement of our economy? In energy, I think we could drive through much greater reform in the direction of a common energy policy and both bring down prices for consumers and businesses at the same time as improve our commitments to the environment. And then on defense, I was British Prime Minister when we began with France, the European defense policy. I think that policy is ever more necessary. Europe has got to have the capability of meeting its own security challenges. Of course, within NATO and in alliance with the United States of America, but in circumstances where NATO or the US is not prepared to act, we've got to have the capability to act. And by the way, I think whatever happens on Brexit, there will be a great opportunity, nonetheless, despite our coming out of the European Union, to cooperate more on defense. And then finally, I think we've got to recognize that on issues of security and issues to do with immigration, this is one of the main causes of the populist sentiment. We have to be able to show people that we're alive to their anxieties over cultural integration and that we're willing to take the measures necessary in order to protect the security of our citizens. And that really brings me to what I think is the central challenge for Europe. I've been part of debates over many, many years in Europe about how do we bring Europe closer to the people. And those debates have often seemed to focus on institutional questions. Now, those questions can be very important, the relationship between the Council, the Commission, the Parliament, so on. But in the end, they don't mean a lot to ordinary people living lives where they're dealing with their daily challenges. And the absolute essence for Europe is to show that by European cooperation and by Europe moving closer together, that it can help resolve those central daily life questions of its citizens. And the truth is that in today's world, that cooperation is necessary because many of those things, economic or cultural, can only be dealt with by nations working together. But we've got to prove this, we've got to show it. And that, I think, is the fundamental challenge for Europe. Brexit, as I said earlier, was not a decision I ever wanted my country to take. But I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we've got to recognize that some of the sentiment behind Brexit is there in all or most European countries. I think it's important, therefore, that even as Europe comes out of what has been very difficult economic circumstances and regains its path of growth and progress, that we deal with those anxieties of the citizen. Because in the end, as I say, Europe is the right idea for the 21st century, but we have to demonstrate its validity as each new generation takes shape around us. And this is a moment of great challenge for Europe, but I still believe in Europe, and I still believe that ultimately it's going to provide much more opportunities than it does risks.